The man with the worn necklace. The cabin of Flight 827 was filled with the usual soft murmur of passengers settling in, carry-ons rustling, seatbelts clicking, and the faint clatter of coffee cups from the first-class galley. Among the refined crowd of suited executives, luxury influencers, and business-class travelers was a man who didn't quite fit the scene. He wore a simple black t-shirt and worn-out jeans. His hair, long and slightly disheveled, framed a face that looked familiar to some, but too unassuming to cause a stir. Around his neck hung a thin leather cord holding a small faded pendant. It wasn't gold. It wasn't silver. It wasn't sparkling with diamonds. It was old. It was personal. And it was the reason flight attendant Clarissa Barnes narrowed her eyes the moment she saw him. Clarissa had been working in first class for over 8 years. She'd seen every kind of passenger, celebrities, politicians, billionaires, and in her mind, first class wasn't just about flying with comfort. It was about appearance. When this man took his seat -2A, right near the front, Clarissa immediately flagged him. Something felt off. She didn't recognize him, didn't see any assistant or entourage. He had booked a first-class ticket on one of the most expensive routes, New York to Tokyo, but his appearance suggested he belonged in coach. She approached with her best customer service smile, masking the judgment already swirling in her mind. "Sir, may I help you?" she asked, adjusting her perfectly pinned hair. He looked up and smiled softly. "I think I'm all set. Thanks." She gave a slight nod, but her eyes fell again on the necklace. That ugly, worn-down piece of leather. It clashed so badly with the crisp interiors of the aircraft. "Sir," she said again, her tone polite but pointed, "you're sitting in first class." "Yes," he replied calmly, holding up his boarding pass. "Seat 2A." Clarissa examined the boarding pass. It was valid. First class. But she still didn't like it. This wasn't about money. It was about image. This was a premium experience. And this man, necklace and all, wasn't playing the part. She walked away, biting her tongue. Minutes passed. The plane filled. Other passengers in first class gave casual nods to the man, some glancing at him with faint curiosity, a few even doing double takes. But nobody said anything. Until it happened. As Clarissa began the beverage service, she moved down the aisle, asking each first-class passenger for their drink preferences. When she reached 2A, her irritation returned. "Champagne, orange juice, water?" she asked curtly. "Just water, please," he replied, still smiling. Clarissa poured it, then paused. Her eyes landed once more on the necklace. "You know, sir," she said, in a tone laced with false sweetness, "we have a dress code in first class. That necklace, it's a bit unrefined for this setting." The cabin around them fell silent. A few heads turned. The man looked up slowly, confused. "I'm sorry," he asked. Clarissa gestured toward his chest. "That thing. It doesn't match the decorum of the cabin. Some of our passengers might find it unprofessional." There was no yelling, no anger, but something shifted in the man's expression. His eyes, once calm, now held a quiet depth. "Oh, wait. It belonged to my mother," he said gently. "She passed away when I was 15. She gave it to me right before she died. I wear it every day." Clarissa blinked. "Well, I didn't mean to offend. I just think—" "I understand," he interrupted kindly. "Thank you for your concern." She turned quickly, cheeks flushed, and continued down the aisle. A few of the nearby passengers looked away, clearly uncomfortable. But the man, he sat still, unbothered. It wasn't until 20 minutes later, when another flight attendant, Jared, whispered something urgently to Clarissa, that her stomach dropped. "You do know who that is, right?" Jared hissed. "That's Keanu Reeves." Clarissa's heart nearly stopped. She'd just embarrassed Keanu Reeves, international superstar, one of the most beloved actors in the world, and she mocked his necklace in front of everyone. She turned, horrified, and peeked at him again. Of course. The face, the hair, the voice. How did she not realize it? Because he wasn't acting like a celebrity. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't surrounded by people or barking orders or wearing designer sunglasses. He was just being kind. And Clarissa had humiliated him. Shame settled into her chest like ice. A whisper of grace at 35,000 feet. Clarissa moved like a shadow for the next hour, her once confident stride replaced with quiet hesitation. Every time she passed row 2, her eyes involuntarily darted toward seat A, toward the man she now knew as Keanu Reeves, a name that echoed across Hollywood, adored for blockbuster roles and legendary kindness. And yet here he was, humble, calm, and bearing the soft sorrow of someone who had just been quietly wounded. The plane hummed peacefully above the clouds, but inside Clarissa's heart, a storm brewed. The words she had said played on repeat in her head like a cruel joke. We have a dress code in first class. The embarrassment hadn't fully settled until Jared showed her a discreet tab on his phone, a photo of Keanu at a cancer charity event, speaking about the necklace, the very one she'd tried to shame. His voice, captured in that clip, had been soft but powerful. She gave me this when she was dying. It reminds me to live. Clarissa leaned against the galley wall, gripping a warm coffee cup with trembling fingers. All these years, she'd convinced herself she was a good person, professional, polished. But in that moment, she hadn't acted like either. Not toward him. Not toward someone who carried pain like a quiet flame. She remembered her own mother briefly, the way she used to braid Clarissa's hair before school, humming an old gospel tune. It had been years since she passed, years since anyone had made Clarissa think about what really mattered. The captain's voice cut through the speaker, announcing turbulence ahead. The seatbelt sign blinked on. Clarissa sprang into action, securing trays, warning passengers. When she reached 2A again, she found Keanu calmly looking out the window, his face bathed in the golden shimmer of the setting sun. The light caught the pendant, making it glow like a memory. She paused. "Mr. Reeves," she began, her voice lower now, stripped of pride. He looked up with a polite smile. "Please, just Keanu." She swallowed hard. "Keanu, I owed you an apology. What I said earlier, it was wrong. I was rude, unkind. That necklace clearly means something deep to you, and I was out of line." Keanu's gaze didn't harden. It didn't flick with ego. He just nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "Most people wouldn't." "I didn't recognize you," she admitted, cheeks burning again. "But that's no excuse. I judged you, based on appearances. And I'm ashamed of it." There was a pause between them, quiet, but not awkward, just honest. Keanu leaned back, still holding the edges of his armrest, still grounded. "You know," he said softly, "my mother used to say the way someone treats you when they think you're a nobody, that's who they really are." Clarissa winced. "Then I have a lot to work on." "Maybe," he said, with the smallest of smiles, "or maybe you just needed a reminder." She stood there, absorbing that. And it was strange, really, how a man with global fame could speak to her not as someone looking down, but as someone reaching across. She wasn't used to that. The turbulence came then, jolting the plane with sudden force. Clarissa instinctively placed a hand on the nearest overhead bin for support. Around her, passengers gasped lightly, but no panic erupted. It was brief. The skies calmed again. "You okay?" Keanu asked, his concern genuine. She nodded. "Yeah, just startled." As she turned to return to the galley, he added gently, "You know, we all carry something. Grief, fear, hope. Sometimes we wear it in the open." She looked back. "And sometimes we try to hide it behind a uniform and a smile." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The next hour passed quietly. Clarissa focused not just on tasks, but on reflection. It was a rare feeling, this kind of humility. But something about Keanu, the way he held space without judgment, made her want to do better, not just for him, but for herself. The dinner service began, and Clarissa offered him his meal, grilled salmon with quinoa and vegetables. He smiled up at her. "Smells amazing." "Thanks, Clarissa." She blinked. "You remembered my name." "Of course," he said. "You remembered mine too." The kindness in that one sentence warmed her more than the cabin heaters ever could. It was like a lifeline handed to her, gently saying, "You can still redeem this." Later, when most passengers had settled into sleep or movies, Clarissa found herself staring at the small crew monitor near the galley, scrolling through flight data. But her mind kept going back to that necklace, that story, that moment. She whispered to herself, "Kindness doesn't need luxury. It just needs intention." Unbeknownst to her, another passenger, a young man in 3C, had overheard the earlier interaction. He, too, had lost his mother. And watching the exchange between the flight attendant and Keanu had stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. That man would go on, days later, to write a post about it on social media, a post that would quietly go viral. But in this moment, none of that was known. Only the hum of the plane, the distant stars beyond the window, and the echo of an apology accepted, not because it was perfect, but because it was human. Echoes of the necklace. The cabin lights dimmed into a soft blue glow as the aircraft sliced quietly through the night sky over the Pacific. Somewhere far below, tiny islands blinked like scattered diamonds. But inside the plane, the world had stilled. Most passengers were asleep, their seats reclined, eyes masked, and dreams adrift. Yet for Clarissa, sleep was the farthest thing from her mind. She sat in the galley, fingers curled around a lukewarm cup of tea. Her name tag, once a symbol of pride, felt heavy now. That single moment with Keanu earlier had unsettled her. Not in a way that demanded shame, but in a way that invited reflection. She didn't just regret her words. She regretted how automatic they'd been. It was like looking in a mirror for the first time and realizing you didn't like the reflection. In the quiet, her thoughts wandered back to her own past. The last photo she had of her mother was tucked away in an old wallet she hadn't carried in years. Her mother's smile in that picture used to light up her world. It had been a long time since she let herself feel that kind of memory. Somewhere along the way, between shift rotations and jet lag, and always being on, she had buried her softness under layers of routine. Suddenly, a soft voice broke her spiral. "Can't sleep either." It was Keanu. He stood just beyond the curtain, wearing a plain gray hoodie, his face gentle with the quiet of someone who respected silence. Clarissa straightened instinctively. "Oh, I just had some tea. Didn't expect you to be awake." He smiled slightly, the kind of smile that didn't belong to a celebrity, but to someone who understood the ache of being human. "Mind if I sit for a second?" he asked. She hesitated, then gestured to the small fold-out cruise seat across from her. "Of course." He sat, resting his arms on his knees, eyes scanning the galley's metal surfaces as if they held secrets. "You know," he said after a long pause, "it's strange. You spend your life in front of cameras, but the moments that stick with you are always the quiet ones. Like this." Clarissa tilted her head. "I never imagined someone like you would think that." "I figured. The red carpets, the awards, the applause." He shook his head slowly. "They fade, or they become noise. But you remember the night someone made you feel seen, or unseen." Her eyes dropped, and she whispered, "Like I did earlier." He met her gaze and gently replied, "Like you didn't, until you realized it. That matters more." The plane rocked slightly. A gentle dip through wind, and the coffee cups behind them rattled faintly. Keanu leaned back, resting his head for a moment against the wall. Clarissa studied him. Not the actor, not the fame, but the man. There was a tiredness behind his eyes, not from the flight, but from something deeper. A weariness worn by people who have carried pain too long without letting it harden them. She gathered her courage. "May I ask something? About your necklace?" He nodded. "What made you wear it all these years? I mean, through all the success. The movies, the fame. You could have anything." He looked down at the pendant, rubbed it gently between his thumb and forefinger like a stone shaped by time. "It keeps me grounded," he said softly. "When my mother gave it to me, she said, 'No matter how far you fly, always remember who you are and where love began.' It's the one thing I own that reminds me I'm just a person, a son, a man trying to do his best." Clarissa felt something shift inside her, like a door she hadn't realized was closed, slowly creaking open. "That's beautiful," she whispered. He smiled again, this time a little lighter. "It is, and it's why I didn't get upset earlier. You saw the necklace, but not the story behind it. We all do that sometimes." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the galley wall. It was Jared, the other attendant, holding a note. "Hey Clarissa, sorry, but this passenger asked me to pass this to you. Said it's for you and Keanu." Curious, Clarissa took the folded paper. Keanu leaned in slightly as she opened it. The handwriting was neat, clearly written with care. "Dear Mr. Reeves and flight attendant, I saw what happened earlier. I lost my mom 2 years ago. She used to say the same thing, that love begins at home and goes wherever we do. Seeing how you handled everything, it gave me peace tonight. Thank you for that. Passenger in 3C. Clarissa covered her mouth with her hand. Keanu looked down, nodding quietly. Neither of them spoke for a moment. And they didn't have to. One small act of redemption, one moment of humility, had just touched someone else. The ripple had begun. When Keanu finally returned to his seat, he paused at the curtain. "Thank you, Clarissa," he said quietly. "For listening, for caring." She didn't have words at first, but she didn't need a script this time. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness doesn't need a uniform or permission." He smiled and disappeared into the cabin shadows. As she turned back to the galley, something inside her had changed. The woman who started this flight feeling superior because of her uniform and role now felt something richer: humility, humanity, and hope. And outside, through the small porthole window, the stars kept gliding past, silent witnesses to the quiet healing of two strangers, forever bonded by a necklace, a story, and a simple apology under the soft hush of 35,000 feet. The ripple that touched the ground. By the time Flight 827 began its slow descent toward Tokyo, the cabin was cloaked in a stillness that only dawn could bring. The sky outside had begun to shift from charcoal to silver, the first hints of sunrise stretching across the horizon like brushstrokes on a forgotten canvas. Most passengers stirred gently in their sleep, but a quiet transformation had already taken place aboard the aircraft. Subtle, almost invisible, but very real. Clarissa stood near the front galley, hands gently wrapped around a thermos of freshly brewed tea. Her shift was nearly over, but her thoughts were far from ordinary routines. Her earlier conversation with Keanu Reeves had carved something open inside her, a place where memory, remorse, and gratitude all met. She wasn't the same woman who had boarded that flight. Something had softened. Something had awakened. She watched him now, seated calmly in 2A, a small paperback book resting on his lap. The pendant still hung around his neck, resting gently on his chest, as if guarding something sacred. He caught her glance and nodded with that signature quiet smile, the one that asked for nothing but offered everything. Just a few rows behind him sat the young man from 3C. His name, Clarissa had learned, was Ethan. He was barely in his 20s, traveling to Tokyo for the first time since his mother had passed. The folded note he had given her, simple, heartfelt, had stirred something in more than just Clarissa. It had reached Keanu too, in a way few things probably could. But Ethan wasn't the only one affected. Later that morning, During the last round of pre-landing checks, Clarissa noticed an elderly woman in 1D staring out the window with tears in her eyes. She leaned down and gently asked if everything was all right. The woman smiled, wiping her cheek. "I watched what happened with Mr. Reeves yesterday. I wanted to say thank you. It reminded me of my late husband. He wore a silly old keychain everywhere. People mocked him for it, even me sometimes. But now that he's gone, I'd give anything to see him with it again." Clarissa felt emotion rise in her throat again. The older woman reached over, patted her hand, and said, "Kindness has a strange way of echoing through strangers, doesn't it?" She nodded, barely able to speak. Even Jared, who'd usually been the jokester of the crew, had grown unusually quiet. As the plane neared touchdown, he whispered to Clarissa, "I saw Keanu help a mother in economy who was struggling with her kid during turbulence. Didn't make a scene. Just handed her a toy from his own bag and smiled. No one even realized it was him." Clarissa didn't know what moved her more, the act itself, or the fact that Keanu never expected anyone to notice. At exactly 5:38 a.m., the wheels of Flight 827 touched down gently on the Tokyo tarmac. A ripple of light applause came from the back rows, the kind that usually marked relief or routine. But for a few souls aboard, this landing marked something much deeper, a new beginning. As passengers gathered their belongings, Clarissa moved with quiet grace through the aisles. She found herself helping more attentively, smiling more genuinely, looking people in the eye. When she reached 2A, Keanu was already standing, backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked at her with the warmth of someone who had forgiven long before the apology was given. "Have a peaceful stay, Keanu," she said sincerely. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. "This is for you," he said. "No signature, no names, just something to think about." She took it, confused. Keanu offered one last smile and turned, vanishing down the jet bridge like any ordinary traveler. Clarissa unfolded the note and read the words slowly. "In a world that often rushes to judge, choose to pause and see. What you find might change you forever." She stood there, breath caught in her chest, the engines of the plane cooling behind her like a sleeping dragon. The note wasn't poetic or flashy. It was quiet. Like him, like kindness itself. Later that afternoon, Clarissa sat alone at a quiet cafe near the airport, sipping jasmine tea. The bustle of Tokyo rushed past the windows. People in suits, neon lights, traffic and time moving at full speed. But in her heart, there was only stillness. She pulled out her phone and looked up Keanu's name, not to remind herself of who he was, but to better understand what kind of man she had met. Article after article spoke of charity, humility, grief, and resilience. There were photos of him quietly riding subways, giving up his seat, talking to strangers without bodyguards. But one video in particular caught her attention. It was from years ago, him on a talk show, holding that same worn necklace. The interviewer asked, "Why do you still wear something so simple with all that fame and fortune?" And Keanu had smiled, eyes shining, and said, "Because love doesn't care about fame, and neither does grief. This necklace, it's the only thing I have that reminds me who I am when no one is watching." Clarissa felt the tears come freely then, not from guilt, but from grace. Because now she understood. When the ground teaches you to fly, days passed, but Clarissa couldn't leave the memory of Flight 827 behind. The necklace, the apology, the handwritten note, the calm voice of a man who could have humiliated her but chose instead to teach her. These things circled in her mind like waves breaking against the same shore. They whispered reminders in the quiet hours, spoke softly in her dreams, and nudged her in every mundane moment. She'd returned to Los Angeles just 2 days after landing in Tokyo. Her layover there had been brief, barely long enough to explore the city. But something had shifted in her. The bright lights and chatter of Shibuya Crossing, the temples tucked between skyscrapers. They all felt louder, sharper, more alive somehow. The world hadn't changed, but she had. At LAX, she resumed her usual schedule. Morning flights, layovers in Dallas and Seattle, the familiar rotation of cabin checks and mechanical announcements. Yet nothing felt the same. Even the familiar scent of jet fuel mixed with brewed coffee felt more human now, less mechanical. She had begun seeing people differently. She noticed the older woman with trembling hands trying to stow her bag, the single father wiping spit up from his baby's chin, the teenage boy flying alone, holding a letter sealed with wax. Before, she might have offered them service with a smile. Now she offered them presence, with her heart. But not everyone noticed. Her colleagues remained caught in the machine of routine. Jared, though kind, returned to his light sarcasm, chatting about celebrity gossip and viral videos. Others still whispered about demanding passengers and shared rolling eyes when someone made a strange request. Clarissa didn't roll her eyes anymore. She couldn't. One night, after a red-eye from Denver, she found herself walking slowly through the terminal instead of heading straight to the crew exit. She stopped at a coffee kiosk where a homeless man sat on a bench nearby, his belongings wrapped in plastic bags. Most people passed him without a glance. But Clarissa paused. She thought about Keanu's necklace again, how something so small, so personal, had revealed the depths of someone's pain and the strength of their heart. She bought 2 hot teas and walked over. "Would you like something warm?" she asked, gently holding one out. The man looked up, surprised. "Are you talking to me?" "Yes," she said, sitting beside him. "I've had a long night. Thought maybe you had too." He chuckled softly, then nodded. "You got no idea." They sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping their drinks. Clarissa didn't push. She didn't judge. She just sat, and for the first time in her career, outside the walls of the plane, she felt like she was still flying. Not with altitude, but with intention. The man, whose name was Calvin, eventually opened up. He had once been a construction foreman, had a wife, a daughter. Life had taken a dark turn after a workplace accident and a string of health issues. His home gone, his family out of touch, and yet there was still light in his eyes when he spoke of his daughter's violin playing. Clarissa listened, truly listened. When she finally stood to leave, Calvin touched her wrist lightly. "You didn't treat me like I was invisible," he said, voice shaking. "You don't know what that means." But she did know, because just days ago she had made someone feel that way, and he, in turn, had shown her the courage to change. Later that evening, she sat alone on the balcony of her small apartment, watching the sun dip behind the horizon. She held the note Keanu had given her, now safely tucked in the back of her planner. She hadn't told anyone about it, not her coworkers, not even her sister. It felt too sacred, too personal. It was her reminder, her tether to what mattered. That night, she wrote her first journal entry in over 3 years. "I think I saw what kindness really looks like. It doesn't speak loudly. It doesn't wear medals or demand praise. It just shows up, in quiet moments, in uncomfortable truths, in the courage to apologize and be better. I want to carry that with me, like a necklace I wear where no one can see it." In the weeks that followed, Clarissa quietly started changing how she lived. She left thank you notes in the lockers of tired crewmates. She carried granola bars in her bag for passengers who missed meal service. She even learned how to say "you are loved" in 5 languages, just in case a moment ever came where someone needed to hear it. One day, during a layover in Toronto, she spotted a little bookstore tucked between 2 cafes. She wandered inside, drawn to the quiet. There, on a dusty shelf, she saw a book titled "The Weight of Small Things." She opened it at random and read. One person's small kindness can become the turning point in someone else's life. We may never know the impact, but we can choose to offer it anyway. She bought the book instantly, scribbled inside the cover, "Inspired by 2A Flight 827. Eventually, she got the courage to share the full story, with her sister, with her closest friend, and later anonymously online. She didn't name Keanu. She didn't need to. But the story spread quietly. It reached others: flight attendants, baristas, teachers, even a small church in Chicago read it aloud during a Sunday service. The ripple had traveled far, farther than she ever imagined. But Clarissa didn't need viral praise. She had something better: peace. And in a world where too many forget that everyone carries invisible weights, Clarissa had learned to see beyond the surface. All because one man chose grace over ego. All because of a worn leather necklace that held the memory of love and taught the world to look again. The necklace comes full circle. 6 months had passed since Flight 827, yet its memory never left Clarissa. Not in the rush of morning boardings, not in the hum of intercoms, and certainly not in the still moments between takeoff and landing when she'd catch herself scanning the faces of passengers, quietly wondering who might be carrying a story the world had overlooked. In many ways, she was still a flight attendant. She still pressed creases into her uniform, still briefed passengers about oxygen masks, still poured coffee at 30,000 feet. But in all the ways that mattered, Clarissa had changed. Not just in how she saw others, but in how she saw herself. She no longer walked the world needing approval from those who clapped for polished perfection. She no longer feared moments of vulnerability, because she had lived through one. The moment she judged a stranger for a simple necklace, and that stranger had turned out to be a man who offered understanding instead of pride. Keanu Reeves never contacted her after that flight. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. His kindness had planted something that kept growing. That was the kind of man he was. Not a storm, not a spotlight, but a steady flame in the dark. One gray afternoon at LAX, Clarissa was asked to work a last-minute luxury charter to San Francisco, a short flight, but a high-profile one. She hesitated at first. It had been a long week, and she felt emotionally worn, but something nudged her to accept. The flight was quiet and sleek. Only 6 passengers. Among them was an elderly man with shaky hands, a young tech executive glued to her tablet, and a woman in designer glasses flipping through a manuscript. All seemed ordinary enough. But as she helped settle the passengers in and offered refreshments, Clarissa noticed a small child, no older than 10, sitting quietly in the corner row, beside a woman in a soft gray coat. The boy clutched something in his hands. At first glance, it looked like a toy, but as Clarissa passed closer, her breath caught. It was a necklace, a thin leather cord, worn edges, and a small faded pendant resting in his palm. It was the exact same kind as Keanu's. Clarissa froze, emotions rushing in like waves against stone. She crouched gently, smiling at the boy. "That's a special necklace," she said. He looked up, eyes bright with quiet intelligence. "It was my dad's," he replied. "He said it reminded him of my grandma. He gave it to me before he left for a film shoot. He said it would protect me." Clarissa felt her knees go weak. Before she could ask more, the woman beside him leaned in and spoke softly. "He's Keanu's son," she whispered. "We don't usually travel with media attention, so we keep it quiet." Clarissa's heart stopped, not from shock, but from the strange, poetic peace that settled over her. Keanu had a son, and the son now wore the same necklace that had once been at the center of Clarissa's awakening. She took a breath, then smiled warmly at the boy. "Well, your dad once told me that necklace holds a lot of love." The boy looked surprised. "You met my dad?" Clarissa nodded, her voice catching slightly. "Once, on a flight, not too long ago. He taught me something very important." The woman smiled quietly, sensing the weight of the moment. "He mentioned a flight like that once," she said softly. "Said it reminded him that even small kindnesses can rewrite the past." Clarissa blinked fast, her eyes stinging. The rest of the flight passed peacefully, but inside her, something extraordinary happened. The past, the present, and the purpose of it all seemed to converge in one clear truth. Kindness never ends where it begins. It circles back, quietly, when you least expect it, and often through others. When they landed, the woman and child stood to leave. The boy turned and held up the necklace toward Clarissa. "I think you should hold it," he said, innocently. Clarissa knelt and shook her head, her smile soft but full. "No, sweetie. That necklace belongs to you. Just promise me something." He looked curious. "What?" "Promise me you'll always remember where love began." He grinned. "I will." As they walked down the jet bridge, Clarissa stood motionless for a long time, heart full. The engines behind her cooled again, but this time, she didn't feel the end of a journey. She felt the beginning of something even greater. In the days that followed, Clarissa took action. She began writing a blog about her encounters in the skies, stories of grief, healing, and unexpected kindness. The post about Flight 827, kept anonymous, became one of her most read entries. Readers wrote in from around the world, saying the story reminded them to forgive more quickly, to love more deeply, and to judge more slowly. One reader, from a hospital in Sao Paulo, wrote, "I gave my mother her old bracelet back after years of hiding it away. Your story reminded me that meaning lives in the things we carry close to our hearts." Another, a teacher from Nairobi, wrote, "I tell my students that anyone could be carrying a necklace of memory, so we must always treat others with respect." The ripple had returned, and though Clarissa would go on to fly hundreds more flights, meet thousands more faces, and walk countless miles through crowded terminals, she would never again forget the lesson she'd learned from a quiet man in seat 2A. A man who wore his grief like a necklace. A man who chose forgiveness instead of pride. A man who changed her life, not with fame, but with empathy.